as Sven says, my background is originally as an ecologist. So I did a degree in ecology, then drifted into technology. So started my first business to pay my way through university and ended up on a business track. That led me through fast growth technology startups and then expecting someone else to fix climate change. So I've known about climate change for a long period of time, understood the severity of it and thought it was probably a government problem. About 5 years ago, I was fortunate to have a business that was paying me a good living without having to work and gave me the opportunity to work on whatever I wanted to. So I started looking at how I could play a part in climate change. And that led me back to the ecology and back to the Future Forest Company. The initial thesis being, if we could create forest profitably, then we could scale it very rapidly. And that was where we sort of started out. So what we do now, and I'll explain how we ended up here and how our journey took us to here, is we co-deploy three land-based negative emissions technologies: reforestation, biochar, and enhanced rock weathering. And we do this both on our own land. Initially, it was on our own land, and then on land that we also work with other landowners. And the idea is that we sequester as much carbon as we possibly can. The reason we ended up co-deploying the technologies was a realization that the competition for land was fierce. So that's a barrier to reforestation at scale, and a recognition that even if you could reforest everywhere, you wouldn't be actually tackling climate change at the scale that we need to deal with things. The benefits that we get from reforestation obviously are carbon capture, but also biodiversity and habitat creation. And that's important to me from the ecology point of view. So when I looked at other solutions, I wanted other solutions that were largely based on natural processes, but also brought co-benefits to the ecosystems that we're dealing with. So the initial reforestation that led us to looking for gigaton solutions and looking for solutions that were in line with the scale of the need. And then a deeper understanding of the permanence and thinking about the permanence on forest. We're okay in Scotland, and the reason we focused on Scotland was with a view to permanence. We've got a good rule of law, we've got a stable social, political and economic system, and we've got a climate that will support trees at plus or minus 2 degrees. And we could see a cooling potentially in Scotland. We don't know exactly what will happen because there could be a weakening of the North Atlantic currents. So we've got to deal with several different scenarios when we're reforesting. The permanence as we move into biochar and into enhanced rock weathering particularly increase. So talking about biochar first, wildfires actually naturally store quite a lot of carbon. We always see them as a negative process that releases a huge amount of carbon. It releases carbon dioxide, but it also forms charcoal. And about 13% of a forest is stored for a long period of time after a forest fire as biochar in one form or another. And you can see on this map that the main areas where the most storage is are the most fertile parts of the world, as you'd expect, the places where we've typically got forest cover. So what we do is we replicate effectively that natural process. We take forestry and agricultural waste, we cook it in the absence of oxygen, which is what's happening in a forest fire when it gets very hot, and it produces a charcoal type substance. That produces byproducts that can be used for other things. Typically, it's hard to actually take the electricity, although it highlights electricity on here. It's hard to get the electricity, but the excess heat is usable, low-level industrial heat. The bio-oil is what Charm are using and then re-injecting into oil wells to permanently remove CO2, where that stabilizes deep down. The biogas is typically recycled to make this exothermic process carbon, reduces the amount of energy, so we don't actually have to put much energy in. Once the process is going, it keeps going. And then we get the biochar. The biochar is beneficial once it's put back into soils. It will buffer nutrients and will buffer, obviously stores CO2 for a long period of time, also creates a growth medium for microbes and fungi. So there's a number of benefits it can bring back by putting it back to soil. Touched on most of these, so it stays around for a long period of time, hundreds, thousands of years. It's a relatively low cost process. That's partly because if you think of all carbon removal as capture then storage, and in biochar's case, the CO2 has already been captured through forestry or agriculture, and all we're doing is storing it. So we're putting it into a stable form. And the potential to scale is huge. Some people are saying that there is as much as 140 billion tons of biomass per year available on the planet. We think if you filter that down, you're actually looking at more like 20 billion tons of available biomass that could be processed in this way. And same sort of thing for rock weathering. So rock weathering is a natural process, and very, very basic overview on the science is that you've got rain falling through the atmosphere, absorbing CO2 and forming a weak carbonic acid. I promise I won't go deep on the science. That weak acid will then react with basic rocks. If you've got the right type of rocks, that releases carbonate minerals, and that's a permanent store of CO2. It can go by two pathways. One is as a soluble mineral that will go down to the oceans, where it tackles ocean alkalinity. The other is it can become a mineral in the soil. But it's very, very stable. You're looking at hundreds of thousands or even millions of years of storage once this happens. It's very hard to reverse. What we do to accelerate that is we take the rock, we grind it to a powder, we then spread that on land. Wait for the rain, that's not going to take long in the west coast of Scotland, but in other parts of the world it can be a lot lower. And we factor that into the equation when we're looking at how much CO2 that's removing. The positive sides of enhanced rock weathering are that it also releases cations. So we've got something that's of very high permanence here. It's relatively low cost. We're accelerating a natural process. We actually are sourcing a lot of the rock where it's a waste material rather than where it actually needs grinding or needs further processing. And that means it's using existing technologies as well. So the mining industry and the aggregate industry are extremely good at taking rock out of the ground and grinding it up. So you've got skills that are already there. And like with the biochar, we can co-deploy this. So we can put this rock on existing land, whether that's forestry or agricultural land, and we can use existing distribution networks to do this. So potentially this can scale dramatically. The potential land available as much as 2/3 of the Earth's surface. Where it gets really interesting, and I know there's people working on this, is in the marine environment, where we've got a lot more available space. Part of understanding the marine environment will hopefully come from the large scale trials we're doing on land. Because of that soluble element of the rock weathering, we can test what happens with that actually as it hits the ocean once we're working at landscape scale. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to scale up to landscape scale as quickly as we can. Because we're working in ecosystems, we believe that the best way to really understand this is to do it large scale, but with basalt, which is a lower impact rock than olivine, and then we can see the impact across the whole ecosystem. So we think it's a safer way of doing large scale trials and learning a lot more, building up a lot of data, which will inform the process. The reason that we looked at these 3 technologies and got very excited about them is that we can co-deploy them. When we talk about co-deployment, we look at the benefits of co-deployment. So enhanced weathering in plants, when basalt in particular weathers, it releases a lot of cations, a mixture of minerals, calcium, magnesium, and lots of trace elements that plants need, phosphates and potassium. And that means you can reduce fertilizer inputs, particularly of some of the very niche elements that we see farmers applying, things like selenium, which will be available in trace amounts in basalt. When you keep growing the same crop year after year in the same ground, these will deplete. So it brings a benefit, and there are studies that are not yet published that are showing significant increases in crop yield, as much as sort of 15% in crops. Biochar in plants, again, there's benefits. This is mainly through the water and fertilizer retention. So when fertilizer is applied, it will wash off. And we know the problems that fertilizer causes in streams and rivers. So biochar buffers that, it holds on to that for a period of time, makes it available for plants for a lot longer. And it also does the same sort of process with water. The third thing it does is it acts as a growth medium. So it's a very large surface area. It's a porous material. If you could lay out 1 gram of biochar flat on the ground, it would cover 2 tennis courts. And that's a growth medium that can protect, it's been suggested to protect fungi, but also bacteria and microbes, which can also then impact upon the enhanced weathering. So when you put biochar and enhanced weathering together, we see various things happening. So there are bacteria, fungi, microbes that will act on the weathering material and speed up the weathering. And some people believe that this is up to certainly an order of magnitude increase in the rate of reaction, maybe 2 orders of magnitude rate of reaction. And this is why we were so keen to get this into large-scale field trials, tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands of tons of basalt going onto the land, and doing this in open ecosystems and trying to monitor those open ecosystems. Because when you study ecosystems, you can't do that in a lab. You can't isolate elements from it because there's just too many interactions. And that's my very quick overview of what we do. And I'll open it up to the floor then to anybody who wants to ask questions.